G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're into session 15 of the book of Ezekiel. We're kicking off in chapter 21, verse 8. We're currently in the present day of the present situation of Ezekiel. In verses 1 to 7, the emphasis was on the fact that God's sword had been drawn out of the sheath, and now the sword is now sharpened in verses 8 to 17. In verses 8 to 17, Ezekiel now develops the picture a little bit further, and this time it's at the sheath, it's now sharpened and polished up. In verses 8 to 13, he puts the whole thing in the form of a song. Now, the song would be sung in Hebrew, not in English. It makes more sense in Hebrew. Now, and the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy and say, thus says Jehovah, say, a sword, it is sharpened and also furbished. It is sharpened that it may make a slaughter. It is furbished that it may be as lightning. Shall we then make mirth? The rod of my son, it contemneth every tree, and it is given to be furbished, that it may be handled. The sword, it is sharpened. Yes, it is furbished to give it into the hand of the slayer. And so that's the first, 8 to 11 verses. Now, in verses, so from verses 9 to 11, this sword is pictured as being furbished. The wording is very poetic in Hebrew, as you'd expect the words of a song to be. It is sharpened, it is sharpened, it is furbished, it is furbished. It is sharpened that it may make a slaughter. It is furbished that it may be as fast as lightning. Means it's been polished up, it's just shiny and ready to go. Now the question is asked, shall we then make mirth as they had been doing previously? This is those in Judah, southern kingdom. The answer is no, not in the light of the coming destruction. Because remember, Nebuchadnezzar is just at hand. Now, the phrase, the rod of my son, it contemneth thee. This pictures the sword as being like a rod on God's son. Remember that nationally, Israel is the son of God. And you can check that out in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 to 23. Let my son go, God says to Pharaoh. Now, this sword is the rod of my son, or what it means is it's upon my son. Why? Because this sword rejects every other tree or nation. This sword is specifically for God's son, Israel. It's for Israel only. So this now answers the people's objection that because of Israel's relationship to God, they thought that they were going to be secure. No, we'll be all right. We got the temple here. Everything's going to be sweet. We'll be all right. Now, quite often people object to Ezekiel's denunciation by saying that God's promise to Judah is secure. But that's actually a misinterpretation of Genesis 49, verses 9 to 10. Genesis 49, 9 to 10. Now, the emphasis here is that this sword is especially for Israel. So again, it is furbished that it may be handled. It means it's polished and shiny that it may be handled. In the end, it is given into the hand of the slayer. Now, once that happens, in verses 12 to 13, the prophet now laments. Cry and wail, son of man. This is God talking to Ezekiel. Cry and wail, son of man, for it is upon my people. It is upon all the princes of Israel. They are delivered over to the sword with my people. Smite therefore upon thy thigh, for there is a trial. And what if even the rod that contemneth shall be no more, saith the Lord Jehovah. So in verse 12, the reason why he's to cry and wail is because, first of all, the sword is upon the people in general, right? And second, it's now upon all the princes of Israel in particular. Both the princes and the people are delivered over to the sword. Smite therefore. Why? Because of the destruction of the leaders and the people. Smiting upon the thigh is an expression of both grief and despair. Another example of this you can find in Jeremiah 31, verse 19. Jeremiah 31, 19. Now, the trial is going to come by way of this sword in verse 13. And what if even the rod that contemneth shall be no more? The point of verse 13 is that this sword has been tested and it was completely capable of accomplishing God's purpose to the full. And with that, the song and Ezekiel's lament ends. And now in verses 14 to 17, the actual execution by the sword is now spelled out. Verse 14, thou therefore, son of man, prophesy. Smite thy hands together, let the sword be doubled the third time. The sword of the deadly wounded. It is the sword of the great one that is deadly wounded, which entereth into their chambers. I have set the threatening sword against all their gates, that their heart may melt, and their stumblings be multiplied. Ah, it is made as lightning, it is pointed for slaughter. Verse 16, gather thee together, go to the right, set thyself in array, go to the left, whithersoever thy face is set. I will also smite my hands together, and I'll cause my wrath to rest. I, Jehovah, have spoken it. So verses 14 to 17 describe the execution by the sword. In verse 14, he's told that this is the sword of the third time. Now, verse 14 starts off with, thou therefore, son of man, because of what has already been said in verses 8 to 13, smite thy hands together. The reason he's doing this is because it's in grief and despair and also in judgment. And let the sword be doubled the third time. Now, what's he talking about here? Well, those who take this whole picture as referring purely to the historical events of this time would make the first smiting would be 605 BC, which is the time of the first deportation to Babylon. The second time would be 597 BC and the second deportation. They would then make the third time, referred to in this verse 14, the approaching destruction of 586 BC. That's if we look at it in the historical context, which most people look at it this way. However, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks that contextually, because Ezekiel is dealing with the prophetic future rather than something purely in the past, the first time the sword is furbished would refer to 586 BC, because this began the times of the Gentiles. Remember, times of the Gentiles was when Jerusalem was now dominated by Gentile powers, and it goes from 586 BC until the end of the tribulation. The second time, so if we said the first time was 586 BC when it all started, the second time would then be AD 70, the dispersion. The third time of which he speaks here will be in the Great Tribulation, and in particular, the events from the middle of the tribulation onward. In all three cases, it is a sword. So the Babylonians were a sword, and he will deal with them beginning in verse 18. But three times this sword of God is sharpened and furbished for one major judgment in each period. Now, these, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks, are Babylon in 587 BC, AD 70, and the tribulation. And we're going to see why a little bit, just shortly. Also, in verse 14, it is the sword of the deadly wounded. It is the sword of the great one that is deadly wounded. We're going to speak a little bit more about him in verse 25. Now, this is this great one, where he comes into the picture again, down in verse 25. Now, at this point, notice here, it is the sword of the deadly wounded one that strikes Israel at this third time. Thing to remember here is that Nebuchadnezzar himself was never deadly wounded. He was never deadly wounded. Now, in verse 15, This is a sword of destruction, and so their heart may melt and their stumbling multiplied. Ah, it is swift as lightning. It is pointed for a massive slaughter. Now in verse 16, they can go ahead and try and prepare for war by gathering their armies and by arraying them to the left and to the right. Won't make any difference. Be no avail until in verse 17, the wrath of God is finally spent. Now, not only is Ezekiel to smite his hands together as a symbol of judgment, but God himself will also smite his hands together until my wrath has come to rest. Nothing that Israel does or tries to do will avail until God's judgments have worked their way out to their fullest extent. Only then will his anger finally be appeased. Once his judgments are complete, his wrath is then appeased. Now, in verses 18 to 32, we see that the sword here is the king of Babylon. In verses 18 to 27, this sword is specifically wielded against Jerusalem. And here he will give us a double picture where the first part deals with when the sword is being wielded for the first time, and then he moves on to the sword of the third time. On each occasion, Babylon is involved. Now, the first time, the king of Babylon is Nebuchadnezzar. That's where we're dealing with at this point in Ezekiel's life. But the third time, the king of Babylon will be the Antichrist. So in verses 18 to 32, the sword is the king of Babylon, but not the same king in each case. However, it is the king of the same city both times. The sword of the king of Babylon will come against two nations. This is in Ezekiel's time. First of all, Jerusalem in verses 18 to 27, and then Ammon in verses 28 to 32. Now in verses 19 to 23, the text deals with Nebuchadnezzar's experience and how he made his decision about which to attack first by the use of certain types of divination. Here we go. This is verse 18. We're going to read down to verse 23. The word of Jehovah came unto me again, saying, Also, thou son of man, appoint thee 2 ways, that the sword of the king of Babylon may come. They twain shall come forth out of one land, and mark out a place. Mark it out at the head of the way to the city. Thou shalt appoint a way for the sword to come to Rabbah of the children of Ammon, and to Judah in Jerusalem, the fortified. For the king of Babylon stood at the parting of the way, at the head of the 2 ways, to use divination. He shook the arrows to and fro. He consulted the teraphim. He looked in the liver. In his right hand was a divination for Jerusalem, to set battering rams, to open the mouth in the slaughter, to lift up the voice with shouting, to set battering rams against the gates, to cast up mounds, to build forts. And it shall be unto them as a false divination in their sight, who have sworn oaths unto them. But he bringeth iniquity to remembrance, that they may be taken. So, from Jeremiah particularly, and other passages of Scripture, that's Jeremiah the prophet, and other passages of Scripture, Jerusalem, in its conspiracy and rebellion against Babylon, was joined by the Ammonites. Rabbah, whatever you want to call it, is modern Amman, which is the capital city of the Ammonites. So, since both kingdoms were guilty of rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar was coming against both of them, but he was not sure which to attack first. And in verses 19 to 20, Ezekiel pictures Nebuchadnezzar as standing at a crossroads, appointed the 2 ways. Where am I going to go, left or right? On the road coming out of Babylon, as he was moving southwards, he eventually came to a fork in the road. If he decided to go to the left, the road would take him into Ammonite territory. If he took the right fork, it would take him to Jerusalem. Now, what does he take? Again, in verse 20, the city of Rabbah, Ammon of present-day Jordan, is the Ammonite capital, and it is the same as Ammon in Jordan today. In verse 21, here we go. The king of Babylon, he's standing at the parting of the ways, and to aid him in his decision, he decided to use 3 types of divination. First of all, he shook the arrows to and fro. This is called bellomancy. Bellomancy. In this form of divination, names of cities or people or whatever are placed on different arrows and put into a quiver, and then they're swirled around until one arrow drops out. The choice is then the name on the first arrow to fall out. That was one method Nebuchadnezzar used. But to be sure, he then used a second method. He consulted the teraphim. Now, these were the little household gods in the form of statuettes of deceased people used for consulting the dead. This is often called necromancy. And thirdly, he looked in the liver. This is the liver, a real live liver, you know. This is called hepatoscopy. Hepatoscopy. Among some pagan peoples, the liver was viewed as a seat of life because it was filled with blood. And they would use either the liver of a sheep or a goat. Once it had been slaughtered, a priest would then make a decision based upon the color or the marks on the liver. Now in verse 22, and the conclusion of his divination, in his right hand was the divination for Jerusalem. All 3 methods had come out in favor of the way to the right, which was to Jerusalem. All 3 of them. To the left would have been to the Ammonites. So the decree was set to go to Jerusalem, to set battering rams to open the mouth in the slaughter. This refers to a proclamation that the decision was for the destruction of Jerusalem. To lift up the voice with shouting refers to battle cries. Excuse me. Now, although Judah could see all this coming, nevertheless, in verse 23, Judah, sitting inside their walls with a temple there, they drew some false conclusions. Now, the oddity here is that they themselves were also guilty of using false divinations, as we learned in earlier sections of Ezekiel. Now, they have the nerve to tell Nebuchadnezzar that he's using false divinations in their sight. So whilst Judah sees the whole thing as merely deception, yet God says it is going to be fulfilled. And in the providence of God, things worked out so that these divinations all gave the same answer. Not because these pagan gods were real, but because God's providence forced the issue. So he will bring judgment upon those who have sworn oaths unto them. This is the Jews to the Babylonians. Remember when this was? Well, probably not. But back in chapter 17, verses 11 to 21, this refers to the oath of allegiance that Judah gave to Nebuchadnezzar, and now they had broken it. In God's providence, he bringeth iniquity to remembrance. He reminds them of their oath. The cause of this judgment is Judah's sin, and the overruling of God is that they may be taken. In verses 24 to 27, Ezekiel now moves on to yet another picture, returning to the sword of the 3rd time. Therefore, thus saith the Lord Jehovah, because you have made your iniquity to be remembered, in that your transgressions are uncovered, so that in all your doings your sins do appear, because that you are come to remembrance, you shall be taken with the hand. And thou, O deadly wounded wicked one, the prince of Israel, whose day is come, in the time of the iniquity of the end. Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, remove the mitre, take off the crown. This shall be no more the same. Exalt that which is low, and abase that which is high. I will overturn it. This also shall be no more until he come whose right it is, and I will give it him. Again, in verse 24, we have a picture of destruction of Jerusalem. Therefore, because of verses 18 to 23, and the fact that You have made your iniquity to be remembered, and because your transgressions are uncovered, and because all of your sins do appear and have become so evident, therefore you shall be taken and you will fall. So because Israel is being remembered by God with all her sins, this judgment is certain. The judgment which began here will continue right on until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. That period began with Babylon in the past, and it will end with Babylon again in the future, because remember, from the study that we did of eschatology, we know that Babylon is going to be rebuilt and will become the world capital of the Antichrist. In verse 25, Ezekiel once again talks about the one whom he mentioned in verse 14, the deadly wounded one. But in this verse, we learn something else about him. O thou deadly wounded wicked one, the Prince of Israel. Now, this cannot refer to Zedekiah, who was never deadly wounded. Remember, he was the last king. Can't refer to him who was deadly wounded, nor can it refer to Nebuchadnezzar. Same reason, he was never deadly wounded. So it must refer to somebody else. Who else could it be? The final ruler of the times of the Gentiles, the last Gentile prince of Israel, ruler of Israel, will be the Antichrist according to Daniel chapter 7. In other passages such as Daniel chapter 11 verse 45 and Revelation chapter 13 verses 1 to 3, the Antichrist receives a deadly wound during the tribulation, from which he dies, only to be resurrected again by Satan. This deadly wounded prince who rules over Israel at the time of the iniquity of the end, and there we have the time reference, which again places this in the prophetic future, he will furbish the sword of the third time. This is the Antichrist. This is a similar term also seen in later on in 21 verse 29, which we're coming up to, and 35 verse 5. This is talking about the sword of the great one who is deadly wounded. This is in Hebrew, all right? So we see it back in verses 11 and 14 as well. Okay, now, what begins with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon and the times of the Gentiles will end with the Antichrist in the future. During the whole of that period, it says, remove the mitre, take off the crown. Now, who wore the mitre? Well, the mitre was the head covering or the turban worn by the Jewish priest. And we see this in Exodus 28:4 and 37 and 39 and Leviticus 8:9 and Leviticus 16:4. So there's several places where we see the priest having a turban on his head. So if we're going to remove the mitre from the head of the priest, what does it mean? It means removal of the mitre means the removal of the priesthood. Take off the crown refers to the removal of kingship. This shall be no more the same. Not going to happen anymore. Neither the priesthood nor the kingship would survive intact. The kingship was removed when? It was removed under the first furbishing of the sword under Babylon in 586 BC. The priesthood was removed with the second furbishing of the sword by the Romans in AD 70. Neither is to be re-established until after the furbishing of the sword for the third time under the Antichrist. So, remove the mitre, take off the crown, this shall be no more the same. Instead what he says is, exalt that which is low and bring down that which is high. So, in verse 27, this overthrow of priesthood and kingship by the first two furbishings of the sword is to last until something specific happens. He says, I will overturn it. Or another way I can talk it, it's a ruin. This also shall be no more kingship, no more priesthood. Whenever there's a triple repetition like this, it is the strongest Hebrew superlative. It is not going to happen. It is going to happen exactly the way this is said. This shall be no more. That is, no more right through at the times of the Gentiles. No priesthood, no king. And so there has been no kingship in Israel since Babylon and no priesthood in Jerusalem since AD 70. This state of affairs is to continue until something happens. Until something happens. It says, until he comes whose right it is, and I'll give it to him. Now, what does this verse sound like? It sounds like Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum says that Genesis 49:10 is not translated accurately, where it says, until Shiloh come. He does not think it should be translated as a proper name there, but it should be the same as it reads here in Ezekiel 21:27, until he comes whose it is. So Genesis 49:10 should read, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruling staff from between his feet until he comes whose right it is. Now, in the Hebrew, it is exactly the same terminology in Genesis 49:10 as it is here in Ezekiel 21:27. Now, so the kingship and priesthood are removed from Israel until the times of the Gentiles have run their course, and until this sword has been furbished for the third time and has done its job by the hand of the deadly wounded one. And then will come the one whose right it is. Itchy nose, sorry. Notice when this comes. Is right. This one who comes, his right will include both the priesthood and kingship. His will be the Davidic kingship and the Melchizedekian priesthood. When this one returns at his second coming, he will restore both kingship and priesthood in Israel. This is the Messiah. And God says, I will give it to him. So the declaration concerning his being given the kingship is found in Psalm 2. The declaration of his being given the priesthood is in Psalm 110. Now, both the Psalms were already in existence when Ezekiel wrote his book. In fact, have a look at Zechariah 6:12-14. Zechariah 6:12-14. So here we have a picture which takes in the full sweep of the times of the Gentiles. The breakdown details have been given elsewhere in Babylon by Daniel, who was Ezekiel's contemporary. So this sword is furbished 3 times. First and third time, it is to be by Babylon. First by Nebuchadnezzar, and later by the Antichrist, the deadly, wounded, wicked one. There is to be a ruin, a ruin, a ruin, until finally he comes whose right it is. Now in verses 28-32, he turns now to the Ammonites. They're not going to miss out. And thou, son of Ammon, and thou, son of man, prophesy and say, thus saith the Lord Jehovah concerning the children of Ammon, and concerning their reproach, and say there, a sword is drawn, for the slaughter it is furbished, to cause it to devour, that it may be as lightning. While they see for thee false visions, while they divine lies unto thee, to lay thee upon the necks of the wicked that are deadly wounded, whose day is come in the time of the iniquity of the end. Cause it to return into its sheath. In the place where thou wast created, in the land of thy birth will I judge thee, and I'll pour out mine indignation upon thee. I will blow upon thee with the fire of my wrath, and I'll deliver thee into the hand of brutish men, skillful to destroy. Thou shalt be for fuel to the fire. Thy blood shall be in the midst of the land. Thou shalt be no more remembered, for I, Jehovah, have spoken it. Now, in verse 28, and still using the basic picture of a sword here, figure of a sword, Ezekiel turns away from Jerusalem to Ammon. Now, this is the object of the prophecy here. In particular, he speaks against the Ammonites concerning their reproach. Now, initially, the Ammonites were part of the conspiracy against Babylon, but then because they joined up with Judah to, cast off Babylon, but then when Nebuchadnezzar was at the crossroads, right, suddenly they pulled out of it, and they sent their ambassador to Nebuchadnezzar to surrender to him. And then when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, they were full of scornful glee at its overthrow. And this is a point that Ezekiel makes again when we get to chapter 25, verse 3 and 6. 25, verse 3 and 25, verse 6. And it's again mentioned in Zephaniah 2, verse 8. Zephaniah 2, 8. So the sword which was drawn against Jerusalem will now be drawn against the Ammonites. And this sword is also drawn and furbished to cause it to devour. As it worked with lightning speed against Jerusalem, so it may be as lightning against the Ammonites. Now in verse 29, the Ammonites are going to be deceived by their own divinations. They will also see false visions and divine lies. Divine as in divining lies. The end result of believing false visions is death, and their judgment will come in both death and captivity. Notice that the timing of the judgment Ezekiel is speaking about here is the time of the iniquity of the end. This judgment is therefore once again in the prophetic future. And only after this sword has done its job to the full and the judgment has run its course will it be put back into its sheath in verse 30. Now, although Ammon will suffer great destruction, it will not be total, because Jeremiah 49 verses 1 to 6 also speaks about the massive destruction of Ammon in the tribulation. Remember, today Ammon is central Jordan. But in Jeremiah 49, 6, after spending 5 verses describing the same thing as Ezekiel is describing here, Jeremiah says something Ezekiel doesn't mention. That is, that God will restore the Ammonites eventually. There will be a future kingdom of the Ammonites in the millennium, but this judgment upon them is certain. In verse 30, it will come in the place where thou wast created, in the land of thy birth, or within their own territory. That's what it means. Then in verse 31, it's clear that this will be God's judgment upon them. He will pour out his indignation and wrath against the Ammonites. He will deliver thee into the hand of brutish men, skillful to destroy. He will deliver them to men who are skilled in slaughter. Now in verse 32, the Ammonites will become like fuel to the fire. It doesn't say for how long, but for a period of time, they will be no more remembered, at least until their restoration, according to Jeremiah 49, 6. The chapter then ends with God's guarantee that this judgment will fall, for I, Jehovah, have spoken it. Therefore, it's sure and it's certain. It's going to happen. Now, coming into chapter 22, we're now going to look at specifically the sins of Jerusalem. We're dealing here with the 4th series of Ezekiel's prophecies concerning Judah and Jerusalem in his own day. And chapter 22 is part of the present situation he's describing, which began back in chapter 20, verse 45, and it's going to conclude with this chapter 22, verse 31. Here he's dealing with the sins of Jerusalem. The chapter here is largely concerned with giving the reasons why judgment is coming, and it spells out 2 key sins of which Jerusalem is guilty. In verses 1 to 5, Jerusalem is described as a bloody city. Here we go, verses 1 to 5. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, And thou, son of man, wilt thou judge the bloody city? Then cause her to know all her abominations. And thou shalt say, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, A city that sheddeth blood in the midst of her, that her time may come, and that maketh idols against herself to defile her. Thou art become guilty in thy blood that thou hast shed, and art defiled in thine idols which thou hast made. And thou hast caused thy days to draw near, and art come even unto thy years. Therefore have I made thee a reproach unto the nations, and a mocking to all the countries. Those that are near and those that are far from thee shall mock thee, thou infamous one and full of tumult. Now in verse 1, once again, we have a new oracle comes to Ezekiel, the prophet. And in verse 2, the theme of this new oracle is, wilt thou judge the bloody city? He's asked, wilt thou judge twice, which makes it emphatic. Will you do this, Ezekiel? Will you do this? Now, as well as spelling out the theme, which is the theme that Jerusalem is a bloody city, Jerusalem is synonymous here with the leadership, since this was the capital. Now, back in 20 verse 4, Ezekiel was told to make known the abominations of their fathers. Now, in 22:2, the Lord says, cause her to know all her abominations. Now they have to face their own abominations rather than those of their fathers. So in chapter 20, verse 4, it was a sin of previous generations. Now Ezekiel is dealing with their own sin. In this chapter, there are going to be two key words. The first is blood. This is mentioned in verses 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 12, and 13. Second is only one word in Hebrew, but two in English. It says, in you. This is found in verses 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 16. Two key words, blood and in you. And in verses 3 to the first part of verse 4, he announces the two main sins which he'll be focusing on throughout the chapter. These are murder and idolatry. The city that sheds blood in the midst of her, there's the murder. And that makes idols against herself to defile her, there's your idolatry. Then he repeats the conditions of the city. Thou art become guilty in thy blood, murderers, and art defiled in thine idols, idolaters. With these two key sins being emphasized, thou hast caused thy days to draw near. This means that her judgment has come at last. It's going to come. The judgment itself is given in the second part of verse 4 and verse 5. The cause of her judgment is her sins of murder and idolatry. And because of these two very prominent sins, Jerusalem has caused the days of her judgment to draw near. Therefore, because of these two sins of murder and idolatry, she is to be made a reproach unto the nations, a mocking to all the countries. This includes those that are near, those that are far from thee. Now, from this point in verses 6 to 12, he begins to enumerate the sins of Jerusalem. And with only one exception, the emphasis here is almost exclusively upon the leadership. Ezekiel continues with the principle which the prophets have spelled out over and over again, and which continues on into the New Testament, especially in Matthew chapter 23, that the leadership of Israel is guilty of leading their nation astray. Now, we see the enumeration of their sins in verses 6 to 12. In verse 6 to 8, he picks on the leaders of Israel. Behold, the princes of Israel, every one according to his power, have been in thee to shed blood. Wow. In thee have they set light by father and mother. In the midst of thee have they dealt by oppression with the sojourner. In thee have they wronged the fatherless and the widow. Thou hast despised my holy things and hast profaned my Sabbaths. In verse 6, the guilty ones here are the princes of Israel. They are responsible for the bloodshed and or the idolatry. In the most recent times, these were the kings of Manasseh, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. Everyone according to his power, meaning that every one of them had misused his authority for the purpose of committing murder and worshipping idols. So Jerusalem's shame is in thee they have shed blood. This is these princes of Israel, these leaders of Israel. And in verse 7 to 8, he now enumerates some specific sins. In thee have they set light by father and mother. In the midst of thee have they dealt by oppression with the sojourner. In thee have they wronged the fatherless and widow. Thou hast despised my holy things, profaned my Sabbath. So first of all, here we see, in thee they set light by father and mother. In other words, they had dishonored their parents in violation of Exodus 20, verse 12, and Exodus 21, 17, Leviticus 19:3, Leviticus 20, verse 9, Deuteronomy 27, 12. They're all there on the screen. I better speak them out anyway, for those who don't have the screen. Second, they're guilty of oppressing the sojourner. The stranger who was just passing through, or the alien resident, became a victim of their oppression in violation of Exodus 22:21, 23:9, Leviticus 19:33, Deuteronomy 24:17, and 27:19. Third, they have wronged the fatherless and the widow. These are the orphans and widows who have been wronged in violation of Exodus 22:22 to 24, and Deuteronomy 24:17, and Deuteronomy 27:19. Fourth, they are guilty of despising God's holy things, those things which were consecrated for temple usage, in violation of the whole book of Leviticus, where distinctions are made between the sacred and the profane. And fifth, they profaned my Sabbaths, violating Exodus 20, verse 8. This is the leadership of the people here. And whichever way the leaders go, the people are sure to follow. So in verses 9 to 12, the people follow. Slanderous men have been in thee to shed blood, and in thee they have eaten upon the mountains. In the midst of thee they have committed lewdness. In thee have they uncovered their father's nakedness. In thee have they humbled her that was unclean in her impurity. And one hath committed abomination with his neighbour's wife, and another hath lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law, and another in thee hath humbled his sister, his father's daughter. In thee have they taken bribes to shed blood. Thou hast taken interest and increased, and thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbours by oppression, and hast forgotten me, saith the Lord Jehovah. Wow. So in verse 9, the people have become slanderers. Slanderous men have been in thee to shed blood. This is what the people have done in comparison with their princes. Now he begins to enumerate the sins of the people. First of all, they've eaten upon the mountains. This refers once again to idolatrous feasts, which included immorality in violation of Deuteronomy 12, 1 to 3, and Deuteronomy 16, 21 to 22. Okay. Second, in the midst of thee, they have committed lewdness. They had been involved in sexual impurities in violation of Leviticus 18 and 20. Leviticus 18 and 20. Third, they have uncovered their father's nakedness in violation of Leviticus 18:27. This is a sin of incest. Fourth, in thee they have humbled her that was unclean in her impurity. This means they had indulged in sexual intercourse during the menstrual cycle, which was forbidden under the law of Moses in Leviticus 18, verse 19, and Leviticus 20, verse 18. Fifth, one hath committed abomination with his neighbor's wife, which is adultery, violating Leviticus 18, 20, and 20, verse 10. Sixth, another hath lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law. This is another form of incest in violation of Leviticus 18:15 and Leviticus 20, verse 12. Seventh, another hath humbled his sister, his father's daughter, another form of incest according to Leviticus 18:19 and Leviticus 20, verse 17, and Deuteronomy 20, verse 17. Eighth, they've taken bribes to shed blood. In our day, this would be known as taking out a contract on someone to kill them. This violated Exodus 23, verse 8, and Deuteronomy 27, verse 25. Ninth, they had also taken interest and increase. Whilst a Jew was permitted to loan money at interest to Gentiles, he was forbidden to do so to fellow Jews because it violated Leviticus 25, verse 36, Deuteronomy 23, 19 to 20, 24, 6, and 10 to 12. 10th, this is a bit of a summary statement of their sins. Thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbors by oppression and hast forgotten me. They failed in the first key commandment to love God. They also failed in the second commandment to love their neighbor as themselves. They didn't care for either. And we see the judgment in verses 13 to 22. It's stated in two ways here. First of all, we see dispersion in verses 13 to 16. Behold, therefore, I have smitten my hand at thy dishonest gain which thou hast made, and at thy blood which hath been in the midst of thee. Can thy heart endure, or can thy hands be strong in the days that I shall deal with thee? I, Jehovah, have spoken it, and will do it. And I will scatter thee among the nations, and disperse thee through the countries, and I'll consume thy filthiness out of thee. And thou shalt be profaned in thyself in the sight of the nations, and thou shalt know that I am Jehovah. This is a worldwide dispersion that he's dealing with here. In verse 13, it is God's condemnation. Behold, therefore, because of the sins which he's just enumerated in verses 6 to 12, God is going to smite them because Jerusalem has been guilty of oppression and blood. God's judgment cannot be withstood. And he teaches this by means of two rhetorical questions. Can thy heart endure, or can thy hands be strong? Both of them require a definitely not, a no answer. In the day that God will deal with them in judgment, they will not endure. They can't stand against it. And the guarantee that judgment is coming is that God has spoken it, and therefore he will do it. The specific judgment again in verse 15 is dispersion. This cannot refer to the Babylonian captivity because they weren't dispersed. It must refer to the dispersion that came after AD 70. As a result of this dispersion in verse 16, Israel will be profaned among the nations. This state of affairs will continue until they know who is God indeed. And the result, it says here, is you shall know that I am Jehovah. Now we come to the smelting furnace in verses 17 to 22. This is the second part of the judgment. It's given to the smelting furnace. And here Ezekiel picks up something he has already stated back in chapter 20, that after a worldwide dispersion, there's to be a regathering in preparation for a more severe judgment than the dispersion was. In Ezekiel 20, the regathering for judgment largely concerns events in the wilderness. But here, he deals with Jerusalem itself. And the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, the house of Israel is become dross unto me. All of them are brass and tin and iron and lead in the midst of the furnace. They are the dross of silver. So the first judgment was dispersion. And following that, there will eventually come a second judgment, which is specifically the judgment of the Great Tribulation, which will do a work of purging. This is something Ezekiel already talked about back in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 33 to 38. In verse 17, once again, the oracle comes to Ezekiel, and this time it's to picture Jerusalem as a smelting furnace or a furnace of affliction. It's a very common biblical figure based upon Israel's need to be refined. In Isaiah, for instance, this figure is found in Isaiah 1, verse 22 and 25, and it's also in Isaiah 48:10. Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 27 to 30, Jeremiah 9, verse 7, Zechariah 13:9, Malachi 3:2 to 3. So this is the furnace of affliction. Israel stands in need of purging, and this will be done by means of a fiery judgment. Now in verse 18, he spells out why this is necessary. It's because Israel is become dross. Now, this dross is composed of brass, tin, iron, and lead. This type of mixture is impure, and it needs to be refined before it is of any value. The way of refining this type of impurity is by means of fire. it will be in the midst of the furnace or in the midst of the fire of judgment that they will be refined. Why? Because they are the dross of silver. Need to get to the silver. So in verse 19, there is to be a regathering for judgment following the dispersion of verses 15 to 16. Therefore, thus saith the Lord Jehovah, because you are all become dross, therefore, behold, I will gather you into the midst of Jerusalem. But here the emphasis is specifically on a regathering into Jerusalem itself. Again, this clearly teaches us there had to be a re-established Jewish state, which would have to include Jerusalem. Not necessarily include the whole land, but it must of necessity include Jerusalem before the tribulation could ever have begun. So whilst the rapture could have occurred before 1948, the tribulation could not have occurred before 1948 because Israel was not a nation back then. The tribulation was never imminent. There are a number of events which have to be predicted, have to precede it, sorry. So again, the place of regathering is in the midst of Jerusalem, and this regathering follows a scattering of verses 15 to 16, this version back in 15 to 16. And it's a regathering for judgment, the specific judgment of the Great Tribulation. So once the regathering has come to a particular point in verses 20 to 22, will come the melting of Israel. As they gather silver and brass and iron and lead and tin into the midst of the furnace, to blow the fire upon it, to melt it, so will I gather you in mine anger and in my wrath, and I'll lay you there and melt you. Yes, I will gather you and blow upon you with the fire of my wrath, and you shall be melted in the midst thereof. As silver is melted in the midst of the furnace, so shall you be melted in the midst thereof, and you shall know that I, Jehovah, have poured out my wrath upon you. So in verse 20, he draws a simile between the regathering of the people and the regathering of these impure metals for the purpose of blowing fire on them, to cleanse them, to purge them. That's why the Jews are being regathered or gathered. So he makes the application. So will I gather you in mine anger and in my wrath. These are the same principles he used back in chapter 20, verses 33 to 34. A regathering of the Jewish people in conjunction with wrath and anger. Back in 33 to back in chapter 20, verses 33 to 34, the Jews were in the wilderness. Here the Jews are of Jerusalem. And again, if there had been no Holocaust, it is doubtful that there would be a state of Israel today. So this regathering is done by means of wrath. But it is also for wrath. It's done by means of judgment in preparation for further judgment. So there's one regathering in the wilderness and another gathering in Jerusalem. Here, the emphasis is on the Jews of Jerusalem. These same two groups are delineated in the last three chapters of Zechariah 12 to 14. Zechariah also speaks about how in conjunction with the tribulation of the last days and Armageddon and everything else, you have Jews in Jerusalem and the tents of Judah outside the land. Whereas Ezekiel 20 emphasized one group and chapter 22 emphasizes the other group, in verse 21, their melting will come by the wrath of God. Yea, I will gather you, this is a reaffirmation of verse 20, and blow upon you with the fire of my wrath, to blow the wrath of the great tribulation on them. And the result is, you shall be melted in the midst thereof. And in verse 22, he draws a conclusion. As silver is melted in the midst of the furnace, so will they be melted in Jerusalem. Now, the purpose of this melting is not for destruction, it's for purging. It's to purge the dross out, purge the rebels out. When this purging is completed, they'll indeed know that Jehovah did pour out his wrath upon them, and this will naturally lead to the salvation of that which has been purged. The same point is made in Zechariah 13, verses 8 to 9. Zechariah 13, 8 to 9, where specifically 2/3 are purged out altogether. while 1/3 is purged and refined and left clean, ready for the kingdom. And that is your lot for today. Thanks for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.